The desert sun hung like a brass medallion in the cloudless sky, its rays beating down mercilessly on the endless expanse of red earth and scattered sagebrush. Margaret O'Brien pressed a damp handkerchief to her throat, tasting dust with every labored breath. Her proper Boston boots, so sensible on cobblestone streets, had become instruments of torture on the rocky Arizona trail. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though the sun's position suggested it had been longer. The stagecoach to Tombstone, her last hope for civilized employment, had departed Copper Creek 2 days before she'd arrived. The mining town itself was dying, its veins of copper exhausted, leaving behind hollow-eyed prospectors and boarded-up businesses. Even the hotel keeper had laughed bitterly when she'd inquired about teaching positions. "Miss, there ain't enough children left in Copper Creek to fill a church pew, let alone a schoolroom," he'd said, spitting tobacco juice into a dented spittoon. "Your best bet is Tombstone, but that's a 3-day ride when the stage is running, which it ain't." Pride and desperation had warred within her as she'd counted her remaining coins. Not enough for a horse, barely enough for another night's lodging. The teaching certificate from Boston Normal School, wrapped carefully in oilcloth in her carpet bag, seemed to mock her foolishness. What madness had possessed her to answer that advertisement in the Boston Globe? Teachers wanted for Arizona territory. Adventure and opportunity await. Adventure, indeed. Margaret touched the silver locket at her throat, her mother's last gift before consumption claimed her. "You're stronger than you know, my darling," her mother had whispered. "Go west, make something of yourself." Now, stumbling along what she hoped was the trail to Tombstone, Margaret wondered if strength was enough when water ran out. Her canteen had been empty since noon, and the late afternoon sun showed no mercy. Each step sent shooting pains through her feet, and her vision had begun to blur at the edges. A lizard skittered across her path, disappearing into the shadow of a towering saguaro cactus. Even the desert creatures knew better than to brave the heat. Margaret's laugh came out as a croak. Here she was, Margaret Catherine O'Brien, valedictorian of her class, about to perish like some foolish dime novel heroine. Her legs buckled without warning. The carpet bag slipped from her nerveless fingers as she fell to her knees in the dust. The teaching certificate, her books, her few precious belongings. None of it mattered now. She managed to crawl a few feet to the dubious shade of a mesquite bush before collapsing entirely. The world faded to a hazy red blur. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, the sound lonely and wild. Margaret closed her eyes, one hand still clutching her mother's locket. She'd tried. Surely that counted for something. The drumming of hoofbeats invaded her consciousness. Dream or delirium? Margaret forced her eyes open to see a rider approaching through the shimmering heat waves. The figure seemed impossibly tall atop a bay horse, moving with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. "Well, I'll be damned," a deep voice muttered. Strong hands lifted her into a sitting position. Miss, can you hear me?" Margaret tried to focus on the face above her. Sun-weathered features, eyes the color of sage honey, and a day's worth of stubble on a strong jaw. The man pulled a canteen from his saddle and held it to her lips. "Easy now," he said as she gulped greedily. "Too much too fast will make you sick." The water was warm and tasted of metal, but Margaret had never experienced anything so wonderful. As her vision cleared, she became acutely aware of her rescuer's arm supporting her back, the solid warmth of his presence. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jim Morrison," he said, helping her to her feet. "Big Jim. They call me. Own the Circle M Ranch about 5 miles north. What in blazes are you doing out here alone?" Margaret straightened as much as her trembling legs would allow. "Margaret O'Brien, I was trying to reach Tombstone. The stagecoach had already gone, and She swayed dangerously. Jim caught her before she could fall again, muttering something that sounded like a curse. "Tombstone's 30 miles through hostile territory. Miss O'Brien, You wouldn't have made it another hour, let alone 3 days. I have to find work, Margaret said, hating how weak she sounded. I'm a teacher. There was supposed to be a position in Copper Creek, but the mine played out. Jim finished. I know. Half the territory knows. He studied her with those unusual eyes, seeming to weigh his options. Can you ride? Yes, a little. Good enough. Without ceremony, he lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. One strong arm encircled her waist to hold her steady. We'll collect your belongings and get you somewhere safe. I can't impose, Margaret protested, even as she leaned back against his solid chest. I can't pay for lodging. Did I ask for payment? His voice rumbled through her. Rosa will have my hide if I leave a lady to die in the desert. Besides, we could work something out. Margaret stiffened. She'd heard stories about Western men and their expectations. I'll have you know, Mr. Morrison, that I am a respectable woman. His laugh cut her off, rich and genuine. Settle down. Miss Boston, I meant you might teach some of the ranch hands their letters. Half my crew can't read their own names, and it's becoming a problem with contracts and bills of sale. Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. I apologize. That was presumptuous of me. No need. A woman alone has to be careful. He guided the horse around a cluster of prickly pear cacti. Though, if you're planning to survive out here, you'll need to learn the difference between a real threat and an honest offer of help. They retrieved her carpetbag in silence, and Margaret tried not to think about how natural it felt to be held secure against this stranger's chest. The rhythmic sway of the horse and her exhaustion made her eyelids heavy. Rest, Jim said quietly. It's an hour to the ranch. I don't even know you, she murmured. No, ma'am, you don't. But I've never left anyone to die in the desert. And I don't aim to start now. As they rode north, the landscape began to change subtly. The saguaros gave way to juniper and pine as they climbed into the foothills. Margaret dozed fitfully, jerking awake each time she started to slide sideways, only to find Jim's arm tightening to steady her. She woke fully when they crested a ridge, and the Circle M ranch spread below them in the golden light of approaching sunset. It was larger than she'd expected, a main house of adobe and timber, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses and cattle. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and she could see figures moving about their evening chores. Welcome to the Circle M, Jim said. It's not fancy, but it's home. Margaret searched for words. After the desolation of Copper Creek, the ranch looked like civilization itself. It's wonderful. As they descended toward the ranch, a woman emerged from the main house, shading her eyes with one hand. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair in a neat bun and a no-nonsense apron over her calico dress. Dios mío, she exclaimed as they drew closer. James Morrison, what have you done now? Found her on the Tombstone Trail, Rosa, half dead from heat and thirst. Rosa clicked her tongue disapprovingly, though Margaret couldn't tell if her censure was directed at Jim or at Margaret's foolishness. Bring her inside. Miguel, ven acá, we need water and clean cloths. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Rosa, who turned out to be the ranch's housekeeper and unofficial mother to everyone on the property, took charge with military efficiency. Margaret found herself in a real bed with clean sheets, wearing a borrowed nightgown, sipping some kind of herbal tea that tasted of mint and something else she couldn't identify. Foolish girl, Rosa muttered as she helped Margaret drink. Walking in the desert like that, you could have died. I know, Margaret admitted. I was desperate. The position in Copper Creek is finished. Rosa's expression softened slightly. But you're safe now. Rest. Tomorrow we'll see what's to be done. Through the open window, Margaret could hear the sounds of the ranch settling for the night horses' nickering. Men calling to each other. Somewhere, a guitar being played softly. It was nothing like Boston. Nothing like anything she'd known. Jim appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "How's our patient?" "She'll live," Rosa said tartly. No thanks to her own good sense. "I wanted to thank you again, Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, acutely aware of her state of undress despite the modest nightgown. "You saved my life." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Margaret said firmly. "They wouldn't have. I won't forget this." Jim cleared his throat. "Well, when you're feeling better, we can discuss that teaching arrangement, if you're interested. Room and board in exchange for lessons. It's honest work, Miss O'Brien." "Yes," Margaret said quickly, before pride could interfere. "Yes, I'm interested." "Good. Rest up. Ranch life starts early." He settled his hat back on his head and left with a nod to Rosa. When Margaret was alone, she touched her mother's locket again. The desert had nearly killed her, but it had also delivered her to safety in the most unexpected way. Perhaps her mother had been right about going west. Outside her window, a coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound should have frightened her, but wrapped in clean sheets with a full stomach and the promise of honest work, Margaret felt safer than she had in months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was alive and no longer alone. The Circle M Ranch had taken her in. Now she had to prove herself worthy of their trust, as sleep finally claimed her. Margaret's last thought was of sage honey eyes and strong arms that had pulled her back from the edge of disaster. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage that had brought her this far. The desert had tested her and found her wanting. But perhaps, with help, she could learn to survive, maybe even thrive in this harsh and beautiful land. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness, jolting Margaret from sleep. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar water-stained ceiling of her Boston boarding house. Instead, rough-hewn beams stretched above her, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something else sage, perhaps carried on the desert breeze. Ranch life, she discovered within minutes, began before the sun showed its face. Rosa appeared at her door with a lamp and a bundle of clothing. "These were my daughters," the older woman said, laying out a simple cotton dress, apron, and sturdy boots. "She's married now, living in Tucson. They should fit well enough." Margaret dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with unfamiliar fastenings. The boots were a revelation, broken in and comfortable, nothing like her tortuous city shoes. When she emerged from the room, Rosa nodded approvingly. "Better. Come, there's work to be done." The kitchen was already bustling. A young Mexican man was stoking the massive iron stove while Rosa began pulling ingredients from shelves and bins without being asked. Margaret rolled up her sleeves and began helping, drawing on her years of domestic science classes. "You know your way around a kitchen," Rosa observed, watching Margaret efficiently slice bacon. "My mother insisted I learn practical skills along with my letters." Margaret replied. She said education was more than just books. Wise woman. They worked in companionable silence until the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Ranch hands began filtering in, hat in hand, nodding respectfully to Rosa and eyeing Margaret with curiosity. She counted at least a dozen men, ranging from grizzled veterans to boys who looked barely old enough to shave. Jim appeared last, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. "Morning, Miss O'Brien. Feeling better?" "Much, thank you. Rosa has been very kind." "She runs this place tighter than any army sergeant," Jim said. Earning a wooden spoon waved threateningly in his direction. He grinned, looking younger and less formidable than he had yesterday. "After breakfast, I'll introduce you around. Let folks know why you're here." The meal was unlike anything Margaret had experienced, mountains of food consumed with enthusiasm and little conversation. She noticed several of the younger hands sneaking glances at her, then looking away when caught. One boy, perhaps 19, with sandy hair and an eager face, seemed particularly interested. When the dishes were cleared, Jim stood. "Listen up, boys. This is Miss Margaret O'Brien. She's a proper teacher from Boston, and she's agreed to hold lessons for anyone interested in learning their letters. In exchange, she's our guest here at the Circle M. I expect you all to treat her with respect." A murmur ran through the group. The sandy-haired young man raised his hand tentatively. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but why would we need book learning? We know cattle and horses." "What's your name?" Margaret asked. "Tommy Martinez, ma'am." "Well, Mr. Martinez, can you read a bill of sale, a contract? Can you calculate the price of cattle at market without being cheated?" She kept her voice gentle but firm. "Can you write a letter home to your family?" Tommy flushed. "No, ma'am, but Big Jim handles all that." "And if something happens to Jim?" Margaret let the question hang. "Or if you want to start your own spread someday, will you always depend on others to tell you what your own papers say?" An older hand, weathered as leather, spoke up. "The lady's got a point. Tommy, I've been cheated more than once by men with fancy words on paper." Jim nodded. "School's voluntary, but I'm encouraging everyone to give it a try. We'll work out a schedule that doesn't interfere with ranch work." After breakfast, Jim gave Margaret a tour of the property. The Circle M was impressive, well-maintained buildings, healthy livestock, and efficient operations. Miguel Delgado, Rosa's husband and the ranch foreman, proved to be a quiet man with intelligent eyes who managed the hands with a combination of respect and firm authority. "We run about 2,000 head," Jim explained as they stood by the main corral. "Market's been good lately, but it's always a gamble. Weather, disease, rustlers, plenty can go wrong between here and sale day." "You've built something remarkable here," Margaret said, genuinely impressed. "My father started it. I've just tried to keep it going and growing." A shadow crossed his face. "Not everyone appreciates honest ranching, though there's been trouble lately." "What kind of trouble?" Jim hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing you need to worry about. Let's figure out where to hold your classes." They settled on a corner of the main barn, where hay bales could serve as seats and a smooth board could be mounted for writing. Several hands volunteered to help set it up, including Tommy, who seemed to have overcome his initial skepticism. That evening, Margaret held her first class. 7 men showed up, ranging from Tommy to a graying cowboy named Walter, who admitted he'd always been ashamed of not knowing his letters. Margaret started simple the alphabet, writing their own names, basic numbers. "This here's an A," Walter asked, holding up his slate where he'd carefully copied the letter. "Perfect, Mr. Walsh. You're a natural." The older man beamed like a schoolboy, and Margaret felt a familiar warmth, the joy of teaching, of opening doors previously closed. This was why she'd come west, why she'd risked everything. As the days passed, a routine developed. Mornings helping Rosa with meals and household tasks, afternoons preparing lessons or mending clothes, evenings in the barn classroom. The number of students grew as word spread and initial embarrassment faded. Even some of the most resistant hands began lingering near the barn during lesson time, pretending not to listen. Jim often stopped by during classes, leaning against the doorframe and watching with an unreadable expression. One evening, after the others had left, he approached her desk. "You're good at this," he said simply. "Thank you. They're eager learners, even if they don't all admit it yet." "I've been thinking," Jim said, settling onto a hay bale. "There are other ranches around here, the W. Patterson's place. Others, they've got hands who could use learning too. And children, the nearest school's in Tombstone, too far for daily travel." Margaret's heart leaped. "A proper school here?" "Maybe, if we could get enough support. Find a location." He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Cedar Springs isn't far good water. Central location. Been abandoned since the Apache troubles ended. But the well's still good. That would be wonderful, Margaret breathed. A real school, serving the whole area. Don't get too excited yet, Jim warned, but he was smiling. Ranchers are independent folks. Getting them to work together on anything is like herding cats. But it's worth exploring. As he stood to leave, Margaret impulsively touched his arm. Mr. Morrison Jim, I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for saving my life, but for giving me this chance. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and something shifted in his expression. You're earning your keep, Miss O'Brien. No gratitude necessary. But he didn't move away, and for a moment they stood frozen, awareness crackling between them like heat lightning. Then voices approached some of the hands returning from town, and the spell broke. Jim stepped back, touching his hat brim. Evening, ma'am, he said formally, and was gone. Margaret pressed her hands to her flushing cheeks. This wasn't why she'd come west. She couldn't afford complications, especially not with her employer. But as she gathered her teaching materials, she couldn't forget the warmth of his arm under her fingers, or the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. Later that night, as she helped Rosa with the darning, the older woman said casually, Jim's a good man. Carries too much on his shoulders sometimes. Tries to protect everyone. His father died 3 years ago, left him the ranch and all its responsibilities. He seems to manage well, Margaret said carefully. Oh, he's a fine rancher, but a man needs more than cattle and account books. Rosa's needle flashed in the lamplight. Needs someone to share the load, someone who sees him as more than just Big Jim Morrison. Rosa... I'm just saying, Rosa continued innocently, that it's nice to see him smile more lately. Been too serious for too long? Margaret concentrated fiercely on her darning, pretending not to understand. But her traitorous heart beat faster, and she found herself thinking of sage honey eyes and strong hands that had lifted her from the dust. On Sunday, the ranch observed a day of rest, after a simple morning service led by Miguel, who served as lay preacher. Families from neighboring ranches began arriving for what was apparently a monthly social tradition. Margaret was introduced to the Weatherby clan from the Double W, the Pattersons with their brood of children, and several others. A teacher, Mrs. Patterson exclaimed, a baby on her hip and 2 toddlers clinging to her skirts. Oh, Miss O'Brien, what I wouldn't give for my older ones to have proper schooling. Billy here is 11 and smart as a whip, but I can barely keep up with teaching him myself. Billy, a gangly boy with rebellious dark hair, scowled. Don't need no school. Pa says I already know everything about ranching. Everything? Margaret asked mildly. Can you calculate how many acres of grazing you need per head of cattle in a drought year versus a wet year? Billy's scowl deepened. That's Pa's job. And when it's your ranch someday, who'll do it then? The boy had no answer, but his scowl softened to something more thoughtful. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself in the center of a group of ranch wives, all eager to discuss the possibility of a school. The men gathered separately, and she could see Jim in animated discussion with the other ranchers, gesturing occasionally towards Cedar Springs. It could work. Mrs. Weatherby said, share the costs, share the labor. Lord knows these children need education if they're to make something of themselves beyond cattle and dust. My Sarah's 14, another woman added. Too old for basics, but she could help with the young ones. Maybe learn teaching herself. The excitement was infectious. Margaret began sketching rough plans, curriculum, supplies needed, possible schedule. The women contributed ideas, their enthusiasm growing as the abstract became concrete. As the sun began to set and families prepared to leave, Margaret noticed a rider approaching fast from the south. The man was unknown to her, sharp-featured, well-dressed in a way that seemed out of place among the working ranchers. He dismounted near Jim, and she saw her employer's face harden. Unable to hear the conversation, but sensing trouble, Margaret watched as other ranchers gathered around. The stranger gestured broadly, pulling out what looked like documents. Jim's response, though inaudible, was clearly negative. The stranger's face flushed with anger before he remounted and rode off in a cloud of dust. The festive atmosphere had dimmed. Families began leaving earlier than planned. Parents hustling children into wagons with worried expressions. Margaret helped Rosa clear away the remains of the social, questions burning on her tongue. It wasn't until later, as she sat on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky, that Jim approached. He settled onto the bench beside her with a heavy sigh. "Trouble?" she asked quietly. "Maybe. That was Silas Kane represents some Eastern interests. They want to buy water rights to Cedar Springs." Margaret's heart sank. "The place where we thought to build the school." "The same. Without that water, none of the ranches around here can survive. It's the most reliable source for miles." He rubbed his face tiredly. "They're offering good money, but it's not about money." "What will you do?" "Fight it, if necessary. But Kane's got lawyers, connections. He plays dirty." Jim turned to look at her. "I shouldn't be telling you this. You didn't come here to get involved in range politics." "I came here to teach," Margaret said firmly. "If that means fighting for a school, for this community, then I'm already involved." Something flared in his eyes: surprise, respect, and something warmer. "You're full of surprises, Miss O'Brien." "Margaret," she corrected softly. "I think we've moved past formalities, don't you?" "Margaret," he repeated, and her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her. "You may regret throwing in with us. Things could get complicated." "Life's already complicated," she replied. "At least here, the complications seem worth fighting for." They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered. The sound no longer seemed lonely to Margaret. Instead, it spoke of wildness, yes, but also of belonging, of claiming one's place in the vast landscape. "The men are talking about lumber for the school," Jim said eventually. "Patterson's got timber on his land. Weatherby knows a man who can get glass for windows. If we move fast, before Kane can file any legal claims." "We'll need books, slates, chalk," Margaret added, her mind already racing. "I have some contacts in Boston who might help, and we'll need more teachers eventually. I can't handle all ages and levels alone." "One step at a time," Jim cautioned, but he was smiling. "First, we need to secure the land and water rights. I'll ride to Tucson tomorrow. File the proper claims. Miguel can handle things here." "Be careful," Margaret said without thinking, then flushed at the concern in her voice. "Always am." He stood, paused. "Thank you for what you said about fighting for the community. Not everyone would feel that way after just a few weeks." "It's already home," Margaret said simply, and realized with surprise that she meant it. As Jim walked away, Rosa appeared at the door. "Coming inside, mija, the night air carries a chill." Margaret rose, taking one last look at the star-filled sky. Whatever challenges lay ahead Silas Kane, building a school, her growing feelings for Jim, she would meet them head-on. The desert had tested her strength and found her wanting once. But she was no longer the desperate woman who'd collapsed in the dust. She was a teacher, a member of this community, a woman finding her place in this harsh and beautiful land. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was finding something more, something that made her heart beat faster and her dreams stretch beyond the classroom to include sage honey eyes and a future she'd never dared imagine. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Springs as wagons began arriving from every direction. Margaret stood beside the old cottonwood tree that would shade their future schoolhouse, watching the desert bloom with activity. Men unloaded timber from Patterson's mill, while women organized food stations for the workers. Children ran between the wagons. their excited voices carrying on the clear air. "Never thought I'd see the day," Walter Walsh said, setting down a load of stones for the foundation. The older cowhand had become one of Margaret's most dedicated students, practicing his letters every evening by lamplight. All these ranches working together like this. Jim emerged from a discussion with the other ranchers, sleeves rolled up and hat pushed back. His trip to Tucson had been successful. The water rights were filed, the land claimed for community use. But Margaret noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept scanning the horizon. "Something wrong?" she asked when he approached. "Maybe nothing. One of Weatherby's hands thought he saw riders on the ridge this morning. Could be travelers, but..." He shook his head. "Let's focus on building. I've got men keeping watch." Margaret returned to her assigned task, organizing the women who'd volunteered to prepare meals for the workers. Mrs. Patterson proved invaluable, directing operations with military efficiency while bouncing her youngest on her hip. "Billy," she called to her son, who was lurking near the construction. "Stop pestering the men and help with the water buckets." The boy scowled, but complied, though Margaret noticed him watching intently as the men measured and cut lumber. His resistance to formal schooling warred visibly with his natural curiosity. "He's bright," Margaret observed to his mother. "Too bright for his own good sometimes." Mrs. Patterson sighed. "Thinks he knows everything already. His father doesn't help, telling him book learning's for city folks." "Perhaps if we frame it differently," Margaret suggested. "Not book learning, but ranch mathematics, construction geometry, business writing." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "You might have something there, Miss O'Brien." By midday, the school's frame was taking shape. The design was simple but solid: one large room with windows on both sides for light and air, a small office space, and a storage area for supplies. The men worked with practiced efficiency, years of barn raising translating smoothly to school building. Tommy Martinez had appointed himself Margaret's unofficial assistant, fetching and carrying while peppering her with questions about the curriculum. His enthusiasm had proven contagious among the younger ranch hands. "When we start classes, Miss Margaret, will you teach us to read newspapers? I want to know what's happening beyond the territory." "Of course," Margaret assured him. "Reading opens the whole world. Pa says the world's full of trouble we don't need to know about." A new voice interjected. Billy Patterson stood nearby, arms crossed defensively. "Says a man needs to know cattle, horses, and weather. Nothing else matters." Margaret knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Your father's a wise man. Billy, those things do matter. But tell me, when he sells cattle, does he just trust the buyer's word on the price, or does he read the contract?" Billy's brow furrowed. Big Jim usually helps with that." "And what if Mr. Morrison isn't available? What if your father needs to handle it alone?" The boy's defensive posture softened slightly. Margaret pressed on, gentle but persistent. "I'm not here to fill your head with useless facts. Billy, I'm here to give you tools like a lasso or a branding iron. But for your mind, tools to protect yourself, grow your ranch, maybe even see opportunities others miss." "Like what?" Despite himself, the boy leaned closer. "Like knowing when beef prices are rising in Chicago, so you hold your herd another month. Like writing to other ranchers about breeding programs. Like reading about new techniques for water management during drought years." Billy considered this. Pa never said nothing about that kind of reading. "Maybe because he never had the chance to learn it himself," Margaret suggested. "But he's giving you that chance. That takes courage." The boy straightened, a thoughtful expression replacing his scowl. "He didn't commit to anything, but when his mother called him back to work, he went without protest." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Reverend Samuel Hartley from Tombstone arrived in his dusty buggy, accompanied by his wife, a thin woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Heard about your school project," the Reverend said, shaking hands all around. "Thought you might need these." He pulled back a canvas to reveal a stack of primers, 2 precious slates, and a Bible.
"Oh, Reverend?"
Margaret breathed.
"This is too generous."
Nonsense. Education and faith go hand in hand. Besides, his eyes twinkled. My Martha here was a teacher before we married. She's been collecting these for years, hoping for just such an occasion. Martha Hartley clasped Margaret's hands. I have more old newspapers for reading practice, some arithmetic books, even a geography text. Would you like me to bring them next week?
"Would I? Yes, oh, yes, please."
As the women talked, comparing teaching methods and sharing stories, Jim and the Reverend stepped aside. Margaret caught fragments of their conversation: water rights, legal precedents, something about territorial law. She filed it away to ask about later. The sun was beginning its descent when trouble arrived. A group of riders approached from the East 6 men, well armed, led by Silas Kane. The construction noise gradually ceased as workers noticed the newcomers. Kane dismounted with theatrical flair, his expensive boots raising small clouds of dust. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, tipping his hat mockingly. "Quite a gathering. Building a barn." "School," Jim said flatly, stepping forward. "On legally claimed land." "Ah yes, you're filing in Tucson. Very quick work." Kane's smile was sharp as a blade. "Of course, there may be some question about prior claims. My employers have been interested in this area for some time." "Your employers are in Chicago," Patterson spoke up, moving to stand beside Jim. "This is Arizona. We take care of our own."
"How provincial,"
Kane murmured. His eyes found Margaret, and something cold flickered in them. "And you must be the little teacher causing all this fuss, Miss O'Brien. Isn't it from Boston?" Margaret lifted her chin.
"I am."
"How interesting. I wonder what a proper Boston lady is doing so far from civilization. Running from something, perhaps, or someone." "Building something," Margaret replied evenly.
"A future for the children here."
"Touching." Kane's voice dripped condescension. "Though I wonder if their parents have considered the full situation. Water rights can be so complicated. Access roads, too. Amazing how difficult life can become when supply lines are." Interrupted. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Several of the men shifted, hands moving closer to their sidearms, but Jim raised a hand slightly, calling for calm. "We've broken no laws. Kane, this is community land. For community use. Your employers have no claim here." "Perhaps, perhaps not. The courts can be slow, can't they? And in the meantime, accidents happen. Construction can be dangerous work." His gaze swept over the assembled families, lingering on the children. "So many things can go wrong."
"That sounds like a threat,"
Reverend Hartley said mildly, but his usual jovial expression had hardened. "A observation about the hazards of frontier life. Reverend, nothing more." Kane remounted, his men following suit. "I'll leave you to your project. Do be careful, all of you." They watched the riders disappear into the gathering dusk. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by uneasy murmurs. "We keep building," Jim said loudly, his voice carrying across the site. "Tomorrow, same time, nobody works alone, we stay in groups. And everyone stays alert." People began dispersing, the day's accomplishment overshadowed by Kane's visit. Margaret helped pack supplies, her mind churning. She'd known there was opposition to the school, but the naked threat in Kane's words chilled her. "Don't let him scare you off," Jim said quietly, appearing at her elbow.
"He's all talk."
"Is he?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. He seemed quite serious about those accidents. Jim's jaw tightened. "I won't let anything happen to you, to any of you. You can't protect everyone, Jim, and this is bigger than just a school now. Isn't it? It's about control of the water, the land, the future of this whole area. You could leave, he said abruptly. Take the stage to Tucson. Find a position there. Safe, civilized.
Is that what you want?
The question slipped out before Margaret could stop it. Jim's expression shifted, vulnerability flickering beneath his stoic exterior. No, he admitted roughly. But what I want and what's best for you might be different things. I'm not a China doll, Margaret said firmly. I'm not going to break at the first sign of trouble. These people, this community, they're fighting for something important. So am I. Margaret.
Besides,
she added with a slight smile,
I've already ordered primers from Boston.
It would be wasteful not to use them. Despite everything, Jim chuckled. Stubborn woman. Practical woman, she corrected. There's a difference. Over the next week, construction continued with doubled vigilance. Men worked in shifts, some building while others stood watch. The women organized efficiently, ensuring workers were fed and materials were ready. Even the children helped, carrying water and small supplies. Billy Patterson had become a regular presence, initially claiming he was just watching but gradually joining in. Margaret caught him studying the construction plans, lips moving silently as he sounded out words. That's foundation, she said casually one afternoon, pointing to the word on the blueprint. I know, he said quickly, then added more quietly. It's got more letters than I thought. Most important words do. Here, she wrote the word in the dirt with a stick, breaking it into parts. Foundation, 3 pieces like 3 stones stacked together to make something strong. Billy traced the letters with his finger.
Pa says I'm wasting time with this.
Is he angry about it? The boy shrugged. Not angry, just, he don't understand why I want to know things he don't. Margaret nodded sympathetically. Change is hard for everyone. Billy, your father's done well without letters. It might worry him that you want something different. I don't want different, Billy protested. I want a ranch, like him, just, I want to know other things too. Then show him that, Margaret suggested. Use what you learned to help the ranch. Read the Farmer's Almanac to him. Help with the account books. Show him that education makes you a better rancher, not a different person. Billy considered this, then nodded slowly. Maybe. That evening, as Margaret sat with Rosa mending clothes by lamplight, they heard horses approaching fast. Both women tensed until Jim's voice called out, "It's us!" He entered with Miguel and Tommy, all 3 looking grim. Margaret's heart sank. What happened? Someone dammed part of Cedar Creek upstream, Miguel reported. Diverted water away from the springs. We broke it up, but they'll do it again, Jim finished. Kane's escalating. Can the sheriff do anything? Rosa asked. Jim's laugh was bitter. Sheriff's in Tombstone. Jurisdiction's unclear, and Kane's careful to use hired men with no direct connection to his employers. So we're on our own, Margaret said. Not alone. Tommy spoke up. All the ranches are watching now. Weatherby's sending extra men. Patterson too. We take turns guarding the water source. This is becoming a war, Rosa murmured, crossing herself. No, Jim said firmly. It's a stand. There's a difference. We're not attacking anyone, we're protecting what's ours. Later, as Margaret walked to her room, Jim caught up with her. I meant what I said before. If you want to leave. Do you want me to leave? She interrupted. I want you safe. That's not what I asked. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the worry lines around his eyes, smell the leather and sage scent that always clung to him. No, he said quietly. I don't want you to leave. God help me. I can't imagine this place without you anymore. Margaret's breath caught. Jim? But I'd rather lose you to Tucson than lose you to Kane's violence. Do you understand? She reached up, touching his face gently. He went very still, his eyes darkening. I understand, she whispered, but I'm not going anywhere. We're building something here, all of us together. I won't abandon it. Or you." For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with possibility. Then voices approached some of the hands returning from patrol, and Jim stepped back. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "Tomorrow we finish the roof." As Margaret lay in bed that night, she thought about the threads binding her to this place, the school rising from desert dust, the children hungry for knowledge, the community fighting for its future, and yes, the man who'd saved her life and was now trusting her with his community's dreams. The morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. As wagons again converged on Cedar Springs, Margaret saw Billy Patterson in one of them, a slate tucked under his arm. He met her eyes and nodded a small gesture that felt like a victory. "Ready to work, Billy?" she called. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, then added quietly, "Ready to learn, too." The schoolhouse walls stood strong against the desert sun, a testament to what people could build together. Whatever came next, Cain's threats, water wars, or unexpected opportunities, they would face it as a community. Margaret had come west seeking a new life. Now, hammer blow by hammer blow, letter by letter, she was helping to build one. The screaming started just after midnight. Margaret bolted upright, heart hammering, as the sound pierced the darkness again high, terrified, and definitely coming from the Patterson wagon parked near the barn. She grabbed her shawl and rushed outside, nearly colliding with Jim in the hallway. He was already dressed, rifle in hand, but his expression softened when he realized the screams were those of a child in distress, not an attack. "It's Emma! Mrs.!" Patterson called out, her voice tight with fear. "She's hurt bad." They found the Pattersons' youngest daughter crumpled beneath the hay wagon, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. The 11-year-old must have been climbing on the wagon in the dark. Children had been sleeping in the wagons while their parents took turns on watch duty. "Nobody move her," Margaret commanded, her teacher's authority cutting through the panic. Years of basic medical training at the Boston Normal School flooded back. "Mrs. Patterson, I need clean cloth for splints. Rosa, bring the medical supplies. Tommy, ride for Doc Granger in Tombstone fast as you can." "That's 3 hours each way," someone protested. "Then he'd better hurry," Margaret said crisply. She knelt beside Emma, whose face was white with shock and pain. "Emma, sweetie, I need you to be very brave. Can you tell me where it hurts?" My leg," the girl whimpered. "I was trying to get my doll. She fell off the wagon." "Shh, it's all right." Margaret gently examined the injury, relieved to find no bone breaking through skin. "We're going to take care of you." Jim crouched beside her. "What do you need?" "Light, steady hands, and someone to keep her calm while I set this." She met his eyes steadily. "It's going to hurt her." Understanding passed between them. Jim moved to Emma's head, talking to her quietly about her favorite horse while Margaret prepared. With Rosa's help. She carefully aligned the broken bone. Emma's scream cutting through the night despite Jim's gentle restraint. "All done, brave girl," Margaret soothed, securing the splint with practiced efficiency. "The worst is over now." For the next hours, Margaret barely left Emma's side. She administered small doses of laudanum from the medical supplies, monitored the girl's temperature, and followed the careful protocol she'd learned wake the patient every hour. Check responses, watch for signs of deeper injury. The entire ranch held its breath. Men continued their patrols, but quietly. Women took turns bringing coffee and soup. Billy Patterson sat frozen outside the door, clutching his sister's doll with white knuckles. "This is my fault," he whispered when Margaret stepped out for fresh air near dawn. "I told her stories about outlaws, made her want to play lookout on the wagon. Accidents happen. Billy," Margaret said gently, "what matters is how we respond. You want to help Emma?" He nodded desperately. Then be the brother she needs when she wakes up. Read to her you've been practicing, haven't you? Help her pass the time while she heals. Doc Granger arrived with the sunrise, gray-faced from the hard ride but immediately professional. After a thorough examination, he pulled Margaret aside. "You did excellent work, Miss O'Brien. Couldn't have done better myself. The bones set clean, no fever, good responses. You may have saved her leg, possibly her life." Relief made Margaret's knees weak. Jim's hand steadied her elbow, and she leaned into his strength for just a moment. "She'll need careful nursing for weeks," the doctor continued. "Complete bed rest, regular checking of circulation, watching for infection." "I'll do it," Margaret said immediately.
"The school," Jim started, "can wait a few weeks. Emma can't."
She looked at the exhausted Patterson family.
"They need help, and I have the skills."
Over the following days, Margaret split her time between nursing Emma and maintaining abbreviated lessons for the ranch children. The schoolhouse stood nearly complete, but unopened. Waiting. Emma proved a challenging patient, frustrated by inactivity, frightened by pain, embarrassed by her helplessness.
"I hate this,"
the girl burst out one afternoon, tears streaming.
"I hate being stuck here while everyone else is doing things."
"I know," Margaret said simply, continuing to check the splints. "When I was about your age, I had scarlet fever, 2 months in bed, missing school, missing everything." Emma's tears slowed.
"Really?"
"Really, I thought I'd go mad with boredom. Then my mother brought me books, not just children's stories, but real books. Travels to India, tales of the Amazon, histories of ancient queens. I couldn't leave my bed, but I went everywhere in my mind." "We don't have books like that," Emma said wistfully.
"No, but we have something else."
Margaret smiled.
"We have Tommy, who's been to California. Rosa, who grew up in Sonora. Your father, who's driven cattle all the way to Kansas. Real adventures. Right here. Would you like to hear them?"
That afternoon began a new routine. Ranch residents took turns visiting Emma, sharing stories of their lives and travels. The girl began recording them in a journal Margaret provided, her handwriting improving daily. One evening, as Margaret changed Emma's bandages, Jim appeared in the doorway. The late light caught the dust motes dancing around him, gilding his weathered features.
"How's our patient?" "Restless, but healing."
Margaret secured the fresh bandage carefully. "She'll be walking by Christmas if she follows doctor's orders."
"And her nurse, how's she?"
Margaret glanced up, caught by something in his tone. "Tired, but managing."
"You've barely left this room in a week. When did you last eat a proper meal?"
Margaret frowned, realizing she couldn't remember. "That's what I thought. Rosa's keeping supper warm. Emma's sleeping. Billy can sit with her for an hour." It wasn't really a request. Margaret found herself gently but firmly escorted to the main house kitchen, where Rosa had indeed prepared a feast. As she ate, fatigue crashed over her like a wave. "You can't save everyone by yourself," Jim said quietly, pouring coffee. "I'm not trying to save everyone, just one little girl who needed help. And the ranch hands who need education, and the community that needs a school, and—" "All right," Margaret interrupted, smiling despite her exhaustion. "Perhaps I do take on too much. But Emma is getting excellent care, but she also needs to see that life goes on, that the world doesn't stop for her injury." Jim leaned forward. "Let others help. Margaret, you don't have to carry every burden alone." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I'm not used to having help to rely on." "Get used to it. That's what community means, what you've been teaching all of us." His hand covered hers on the table, warm and calloused. "Let us take care of you too." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then footsteps on the porch broke the spell, Billy arriving for his watch shift. That night, a thunderstorm rolled across the desert, bringing blessed rain and cooler temperatures. Margaret lay wakeful, listening to the rhythm on the roof, thinking about Jim's words and the feeling of his hand over hers. Near dawn, she was jolted by shouts. Through the window, she saw riders approaching through the gray light. Not Kane's men, but neighbors from outlying ranches, their faces grim. Rustlers hit the Weatherby place, the lead rider reported as people gathered. Took 50 head, maybe more. Weatherby's boy Sam tried to stop them. He's shot up pretty bad. Margaret's heart sank.
First Emma's accident, now this.
Jim was already organizing search parties when she reached the main room.
Medical supplies?
She asked Rosa. Already packing them. You'll go?
If someone can watch Emma. I'll do it, Mrs., Patterson said firmly. You saved my girl, least I can do.
Within minutes. Margaret was in a wagon beside Jim, medical supplies at her feet, heading for the Double W. The rain had stopped, but clouds still lowered, matching the grim mood. They found chaos at the Weatherby ranch. Sam, barely 18, lay on the kitchen table, blood seeping through makeshift bandages. His mother stood frozen while his father paced, cursing steadily. Margaret pushed past them all, her training taking over. The wound was through the shoulder, painful and bloody, but not immediately fatal if properly treated. She worked steadily, cleaning and stitching while Jim and others held the boy still. Will he... Mrs. Weatherby couldn't finish.
He's young and strong,
Margaret said carefully.
If we can prevent infection, he should recover, but he needs rest and careful watching.
As she worked, she heard the men talking tracks leading south toward Mexico. Too much of a head start to catch. The rustlers had struck during the storm, using the weather as cover. Some suspected Kane's involvement, though proving it would be impossible. First accidents, now rustlers. Patterson said darkly. Seems mighty convenient.
Convenient or not, we deal with what is. Jim replied, double the night watches. Nobody rides alone.
Young Sam Weatherby stabilized as the day wore on. Margaret finally sat back, exhausted but satisfied. Another crisis managed, another life preserved. But the toll was showing on everyone, the constant vigilance, the mounting threats, the fear that Kane's promises of accidents were coming true. That evening, back at the Circle M, Margaret found herself standing with Jim on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains crimson. Emma was sleeping peacefully. Sam Weatherby was out of immediate danger, but the weight of recent events pressed on them all. You were magnificent today, Jim said quietly. Both with Emma and Sam. We're lucky to have you.
I'm just doing what needs doing.
No. He turned to face her fully. You're doing far more. You're holding us together, teaching, healing, giving us hope for something better. He paused, seeming to struggle with words. I need to tell you something. Margaret's heart accelerated.
Yes.
The talk about me being violent, about past troubles, there's truth mixed with lies. 5 years ago, there was a dispute over water rights. Cole Redden was involved. Working for different employers then, he drew first, but I shot back. A man died. Not Redden, his partner. I was cleared of wrongdoing, but the story grew in the telling. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know who you're standing beside. Kane will use it against us, paint me as a violent man, unsuitable to lead a community effort. And maybe, his voice roughened, maybe you should distance yourself before that mud splashes on you. Margaret studied his face, the pain there, the self-doubt, the expectation of rejection. She made her decision instantly.
Jim Morrison,
she said firmly.
I've seen who you are. You're the man who saved my life, who builds schools instead of destroying them, who holds dying children with gentle hands. I don't care about 5-year-old stories. I care about now. Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability, hope, and deep emotion. Margaret, Besides, she continued, fighting to keep her voice steady, if we're sharing truths,
You should know I came west partly because of a scandal. The school board president's son made unwanted advances. When I refused and reported him, suddenly my position was eliminated. My reputation in Boston is quite ruined." "Their loss," Jim said fiercely. "Any man who'd force his attention—" He broke off, fists clenching. "Is not worth our anger," Margaret finished. "We both have pasts. What matters is what we build now." They stood close, the air between them charged with everything unsaid. Jim raised his hand slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "What are we building, Margaret?" he asked softly. Before she could answer, Rosa's voice called from inside. "Miss Margaret, Emma's asking for you." The moment shattered. Margaret stepped back, cheeks flushed. "I should go." "Margaret." "We'll talk later," she promised, and fled inside before her composure could crack entirely. But later brought only more challenges. A report came that someone had poisoned a well on the eastern range, not fatally, just enough to make the cattle sick. To send a message, the school stood ready but unopened, its windows like empty eyes watching over a community under siege. That night, Margaret sat beside Emma's bed, teaching her to form letters with her left hand while her right healed. Billy read aloud from the primer, stumbling but determined. Outside, men patrolled in the darkness, protecting what they'd built together. "Miss Margaret," Emma said sleepily, "will the school really open, or will the bad men stop it?" Margaret squeezed the girl's good hand gently. "It will open," she promised. "Maybe not next week, maybe not exactly as we planned, but it will open. We don't give up. Emma, that's not who we are." The girl smiled and drifted off to sleep. Margaret sat in the lamplight, keeping watch, thinking of all the promises made and threatened Cain's warnings, Jim's unfinished words, her own determination to see this through. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she would guard this small piece, a child healing, a community united, and somewhere in the darkness, a good man standing watch over them all. The school would open, the threats would be faced, and perhaps when the dust settled, she and Jim could finish that conversation that seemed always to be interrupted by duty and danger. The desert wind whispered against the windows, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Margaret adjusted Emma's blanket and settled in for another long night, her mother's locket warm against her skin, a reminder of strength, of purpose, and of the courage to build something lasting in this wild and challenging land. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the mountains in a wall of black clouds that turned afternoon into twilight. Margaret had ridden out with Jim to check on the eastern water source, a journey that should have taken 3 hours at most. Now, with the sky splitting open and rain driving sideways, they urged their horses toward the old line shack on Cougar Ridge. "There!" Jim shouted over the wind, pointing to the small wooden structure barely visible through the downpour. They burst through the door just as hail began mixing with the rain, the ice stones drumming against the roof like gunfire. The shack was basic one room with a stone fireplace, a few rough bunks, and supplies for cowboys caught in bad weather, but it was dry and solid. "Are you hurt?" Jim asked immediately, water streaming from his hat brim. "Just wet," Margaret assured him, though her teeth were chattering. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, her riding dress, practical for a sunny day, now clung cold and heavy. Jim was already moving, gathering kindling from the wood box. "Need to get a fire going. These mountain storms can last hours." Margaret helped, her frozen fingers fumbling with the matches. Finally, blessed warmth began to fill the small space. She stood as close to the flames as she dared, steam rising from her soaked clothing. "You're shivering," Jim observed. He grabbed a blanket from one of the bunks, wrapping it around her shoulders. His hands lingered for a moment, warming her upper arms through the wool. "Thank you." The words came out as a whisper. They were very close, very alone. and the awareness of it sparked between them like the fire in the hearth. Jim stepped back, busying himself with checking their supplies. Looks like the last patrol left coffee and hardtack. Not fancy, but it'll do. They worked in companionable silence, setting up a simple meal while the storm raged outside, the familiar domestic rhythm so like their evening routines at the ranch, yet charged with different energy in this isolated shelter. I used to love storms as a child, Margaret said, settling on a wooden crate near the fire. They felt like adventure, like the world was changing right before your eyes. And now I know sometimes the world does change in a storm. She met his gaze steadily. The day you found me in the desert, that was a different kind of storm. Changed my world too, Jim admitted quietly. He sat across from her, the firelight playing across his features. Never expected to find a proper Boston lady willing to fight for a bunch of dusty cowboys and their dreams. They're my dreams too now. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter, not entirely from cold. The school, the community, all of it. Just that, nothing else. The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret's heart raced, but she held his gaze. What are you asking me, Jim? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I'm asking what I've been trying to ask for weeks, only something always interrupts. I'm asking if maybe you feel what I feel when we're together. If maybe there's room in those dreams for us. Margaret's breath caught. Jim! I know I'm just a rancher. I know you could do better, a teacher, educated, refined, but Margaret, He stopped, running a hand through his damp hair in frustration. I'm no good with pretty words. Then use plain ones, she said softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her tremble. I love you. Plain enough, I love your strength and your stubbornness. I love how you see the best in people, how you fight for what's right. I love the way you hold a book like it's precious, and how you get that little line between your brows when you're concentrating. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window where rain streamed down the glass. I know I've got no right. Jim! Margaret rose, letting the blanket fall. She crossed to him, laying her hand on his arm. You have every right, because I love you too. He turned sharply, searching her face. Margaret, I love you, she repeated, marveling at how easy the words came. I think I have since that first day, when you could have left me but didn't, when you offered me work instead of charity, respect instead of pity. His hands came up to frame her face, trembling slightly. You mean it? James Morrison, I am not in the habit of saying things I don't mean. He laughed then, a sound of pure joy that transformed his face. No, you certainly aren't. My practical, wonderful, brave Margaret. You're Margaret, she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. If you'll have me, I can't offer much a ranch that's always one bad year from trouble, a life that's more work than leisure. And Lord knows Cain's making even that uncertain. Margaret silenced him by pressing her fingers to his lips. I don't want much. I want a partner, not a provider. I want to build something together, the school, the community, a life. Can you offer that? Every day for the rest of my life, he vowed. The storm chose that moment to intensify, thunder shaking the little shack. Margaret startled, and Jim's arms came around her, steady and sure. Just thunder, he murmured against her hair. You're safe. She tilted her face up to his. I know. Time seemed to slow as he lowered his head. Their first kiss was gentle, almost hesitant. A question asked and answered. Margaret's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart race to match hers. When they parted, Jim rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the day you stood up to Cain. Only then, she teased, surprising herself with her boldness. Well, maybe a bit before. He pulled her closer, and she went willingly, fitting against him as if she belonged there. Margaret, I want to do this right. Court you properly. Marry you in front of the whole community."
"Yes," she interrupted. "I haven't asked yet." "Then ask."
He pulled back enough to see her face, his expression suddenly serious. "Margaret O'Brien, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, mother to the children I hope we'll have? Will you help me build not just a school, but a life?"
"Yes,"
she said again, tears pricking her eyes.
"Yes to all of it."
He kissed her again, deeper this time, conveying without words the depth of his feeling. Margaret responded in kind, her usual reserve swept away by the storm of emotion. When breathlessness forced them apart, they stood wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the rain.
"We should probably wait to announce it,"
Jim said eventually, ever practical. "Until Kane's dealt with, until things are settled. If you think I'm keeping this secret, you don't know me at all," Margaret informed him. "I'm not ashamed of loving you. Jim Morrison, let Kane and everyone else know we're united. It might even strengthen our position." He grinned. "Spoken like a true rancher's wife, strategic thinking." "Future rancher's wife," she corrected. "And still a teacher. I won't give that up. Wouldn't ask you to. The school needs you. The community needs you." His arms tightened. "I need you." They talked as the storm raged, plans and dreams, practical matters and flights of fancy. Jim told her about his hopes to expand the ranch, to bring in new breeding stock, to build a proper house where the old cabin stood. Margaret shared her vision for the school, multiple teachers eventually, a library, maybe even higher education for those who wanted it. "Big dreams," Jim mused, playing with a strand of her hair that had come loose. "Worth having," Margaret replied. "Worth fighting for." The storm began to ease as evening approached, the drumming rain softening to a patter. They'd need to leave soon, to return before full dark and worried search parties. But for now, they sat close by the fire, Margaret in the circle of Jim's arms, both reluctant to break this perfect moment. "What will Rosa say?" Margaret wondered aloud. Jim chuckled. "Probably about time. She's been dropping hints like anvils for weeks. And the hands, they'll be happy. You've won them over completely." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I might have to have words with Tommy about the calf eyes he makes at you." Margaret laughed. "He's sweet. They all are, in their rough way. My rough cowboys and their proper teacher," Jim mused. "What a pair we make." "A good pair," Margaret said firmly. "A strong pair." The rain had nearly stopped. Through the window, they could see breaks in the clouds, late sunlight slanting through in golden beams. The world looked washed clean, renewed. "We should go," Jim said reluctantly. "In a moment." Margaret turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "I want to remember this. All of it. The storm, the fire, the way you look at me." "Like you're everything," Jim suggested. "Because you are, my wild desert angel." "Hardly an angel." "To me you are, always will be." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "No matter what comes, Kane, drought, trouble, we face it together now." "Together," Margaret agreed. They prepared to leave, dousing the fire and securing the shack for the next traveler who might need shelter. As they stepped outside, the setting sun painted the wet desert in shades of gold and crimson. The air smelled of sage and rain, fresh and full of promise. Jim helped Margaret mount her horse, his hands lingering at her waist. "Ready?" She looked down at him, this man who'd become everything, and smiled. "For anything." They rode back toward the Circle M as the first stars appeared, picking their way carefully on the rain-softened trail. Behind them, the line shack stood empty again, but it had served its purpose, sheltering not just from the storm, but providing a place where two hearts could finally speak their truth. Margaret thought of the title phrase from the romance novel she'd confiscated from Emma, wilder than midnight fire. She'd thought it overwrought at the time, but now she understood what she felt for Jim. What they'd found together burned brighter than any flame, stronger than any storm. As the lights of the ranch came into view, Jim reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "No going back now," he said. "No going back," Margaret agreed, squeezing his fingers. "Only forward." Tomorrow would bring its challenges, Kane's threats, the school to finish, a community to protect. But tonight, they rode home together, partners in truth now, ready to face whatever the desert might throw at them. The storm had passed, leaving the world renewed. And in its wake, two souls had found their way to each other, forging a bond that would prove stronger than any challenge, wilder than midnight fire, deeper than desert springs, and as enduring as the mountains that watched over them all. The smell of smoke reached them before they saw the flames. Jim pulled his horse up sharp, his face going pale in the pre-dawn light. "The hay barn," he said, and spurred his mount forward. By the time they reached the ranch, half the stored winter feed was ablaze. Men ran with buckets, forming chains from the well. But Margaret could see it was hopeless. The flames had too much of a head start. "Get the livestock clear," Jim shouted, leaping from his saddle. "Miguel, wet down the other buildings, don't let it spread." Margaret joined Rosa at the water pump, working the handle until her arms burned while others filled bucket after bucket. The heat was incredible, pushing them back even from a distance. Sparks flew on the wind, threatening the school just a quarter-mile away. "The school," Margaret gasped. "Tommy's already there with others," Rosa assured her. "They're soaking the walls and roof." It took 3 hours to bring the fire under control. When the sun rose fully, it illuminated a scene of exhaustion and loss. The hay barn was gone, taking with it most of their winter feed. Without it, they'd have to sell off cattle or buy feed at ruinous prices. Jim stood staring at the smoldering ruins, his face carved from stone. Patterson and Weatherby had arrived to help, and now they gathered around him. "This wasn't no accident," Patterson said flatly. "I found tracks leading south, and this." He held up a coal oil can. "Store-bought and new." "Kane," Weatherby growled. "Knowing and proving are different things," Jim said tiredly. He turned to Margaret, soot streaking his face. "You should go inside, get some rest." "We should go to the sheriff," Margaret insisted. "File a report." "With what evidence? Tracks that lead nowhere and a can anyone could buy." Jim's voice held an edge of defeat she'd never heard before. "Kane's too smart to leave proof." That afternoon, Margaret worked on a different kind of evidence, with Martha Hartley's help. She drafted careful letters to newspapers in Tucson and even San Francisco, describing the situation at Cedar Springs. If the law couldn't help, perhaps public pressure could. "Make sure to mention the school," Martha advised. "People sympathize with children's education being threatened." As Margaret wrote, she heard riders approaching. Through the window, she saw Jim and the other ranchers mounting up, all armed. Her heart clenched. "Where are you going?" she demanded, rushing outside. "To have a talk with Kane," Jim said grimly. "No." Margaret grabbed his horse's bridle. "This is what he wants to provoke you into violence. Then he can have you arrested, or worse." "What would you have us do?" Patterson demanded. "Sit back while he burns us out one by one." "Fight smarter," Margaret urged. "I'm writing to newspapers. Martha's contacting church groups. We have the legal documents from Tucson. Use the law." "The law's 3 days away and doesn't care about ranch folks' troubles." Weatherby interrupted. "Then we make them care." Margaret looked up at Jim. "Please, trust me. Give me 2 days to try it my way." Jim studied her face, then slowly dismounted. The other men muttered, but followed his lead. 2 days, he agreed. But Margaret, if there's another attack—
There won't be, she said with more confidence than she felt. Kane's getting desperate. Desperate men make mistakes.
That night, the Circle M felt like an armed camp. Men patrolled in shifts, everyone edgy and short-tempered. Margaret found Jim on the porch, staring out at the darkness.
Can't sleep either, she asked, settling beside him.
Keep thinking about Pa. He admitted. He built that barn the year I was born. 40 years of keeping this place going. And I'm losing it piece by piece.
You're not losing it, Margaret said firmly. You're fighting for it. There's a difference.
Is there? Seems like Kane's winning every round. Margaret took his hand, lacing their fingers together.
He's won some battles, but the war that's still being fought. You sound mighty sure.
Because I know something Kane doesn't. She squeezed his hand. I know the people he's fighting.
You don't give up. Jim Morrison, none of you do. That's why I fell in love with this place, with these people.
She paused.
With you.
He turned to her then, pulling her close.
Don't know what I'd do without you.
You won't have to find out,
she promised.
The next morning brought unexpected allies. Reverend Hartley arrived with a delegation from Tombstone, 3 members of the Territorial Council, including Judge William Brennan. Got your wife's letter? The judge told Jim.
Well, your intended's letter. I hear, congratulations. By the way, about time you settled down.
Jim flushed slightly. Thank you, sir, but about the letter? Made some compelling points about water rights and community development. Council's been concerned about these Eastern speculators trying to monopolize resources. The judge accepted Rosa's offer of coffee. Mind if we look at those documents from Tucson? For the next hour, Margaret watched as the legal minds examined their papers, asked sharp questions, and took notes. Her heart lifted with each nod, each interesting murmured by the judge. Here's the thing. Judge Brennan finally said, your claim is solid. Predates any Kane might file, but he's challenging the underlying survey, claiming the boundaries are wrong. It's a delaying tactic, but effective.
So we're stuck? Jim asked.
Not necessarily. There's a provision in territorial law if a community improvement is underway and near completion. It gains protected status during legal challenges. The judge's eyes twinkled.
How close is that school to opening?
Structure's complete, Margaret said quickly.
We just need to install the desks. Stock supplies.
Do it, the judge advised. Open that school officially, with students attending, and Kane can't touch Cedar Springs without facing criminal charges. Interfering with public education is a serious matter in the territory. Hope sparked in Jim's eyes.
How long do we have?
I can delay Kane's filing for maybe a week. After that, the judge shrugged. A week, Jim repeated. He looked at Margaret.
Can we do it?
We'll have to, she said simply. What followed was organized chaos. Every available hand was pressed into service. Desks were hastily constructed from available lumber. The precious books and slates were unpacked and arranged. Women sewed curtains for the windows, while men built outhouses and dug a new well. Margaret worked tirelessly, organizing and directing, but always, she kept one eye on the horizon, watching for Kane's men. They were racing against time and enemies both. On the 3rd day, Billy Patterson approached her, clutching a piece of paper.
Miss Margaret, I wrote something for the school opening.
Margaret read his carefully printed words, a simple poem about learning and growing. Her eyes misted.
Billy, this is wonderful.
Would you read it at the ceremony? The boy flushed with pride. You really think it's good? I think it shows how far you've come. Your father will be so proud. He is, Patterson said, appearing behind his son. Both of us are. Thank you, Miss O'Brien, for not giving up on him.
I never give up on my students,
Margaret replied. That evening, as she and Jim walked through the nearly ready school, checking last details. He suddenly stopped. "What is it?"
"Listen," he said. In the distance, she heard it horses. Moving fast, many horses. Jim's hand went to his gun, but Margaret caught his arm.
"Wait, listen harder." The riders came into view, not Kane's hired gunmen, but families. Wagons loaded with children and supplies. The Hendersons from Box Canyon. The Smiths from Willow Creek. Even the Johnsons, who lived nearly a day's ride away. "Heard you were opening a school," Henderson called out. "Figured you might need students." Margaret's throat tightened as more and more families arrived. By full dark, the area around the school looked like a festival camp. Children ran everywhere, excited about the promised education. Parents shared food and stories. It was community in its purest form. "Kane can't fight this," Jim murmured in wonder. "Not all of us together." Judge Brennan, who'd stayed to witness the opening, nodded approvingly. 23 students by my count. That's a proper school by any measure." But Margaret knew Kane wouldn't give up easily. She organized watches through the night, families taking turns guarding their hope made manifest in wood and stone. Near midnight, her fears were realized. A lone rider approached under a white flag, Cole Redden, Kane's enforcer. Jim and the other men met him at the edge of the light. "Come to burn us out again," Patterson growled. Redden ignored him, addressing Jim. "Mr. Kane offers one last deal. Sell the water rights, and he'll ensure the school stays open, even fund it proper-like. Nobody else gets hurt, everybody wins. Except when he controls the water and starves us out slowly." Jim replied, "No deal." "Then Kane says to remind you the law's a slow beast. Accidents happen while judges deliberate. Fire spreads fast. People get hurt." His gaze swept the camp, lingering on the playing children. Shame if something happened during tomorrow's pretty ceremony. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Several men reached for weapons, but Jim held up a hand. "You tell Kane," he said quietly, "that if one child is harmed, one family threatened, there won't be enough law between here and Chicago to save him. That's not a threat, it's a promise." Redden smiled coldly. "Big words. Morrison? Hope you can back them up." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and congratulations on your engagement. Pretty lady like that. Must worry you, all the dangers out here." Jim took a step forward, but Margaret appeared beside him, chin high. "Mr. Redden," she said clearly. "I've survived desert heat, student stubbornness, and your employer's ham-handed threats. I'm exactly where I choose to be, with whom I choose. Perhaps Mr. Kane should worry less about me and more about the federal marshals the judge has summoned." Redden's smile faltered. "You're bluffing." Judge Brennan stepped into the light. "Actually, she's not. Telegram went out this afternoon. Seems the territorial government takes a dim view of thugs threatening schools." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Redden's eyes. He wheeled his horse without another word and galloped into the darkness. "Is it true?" Jim asked the judge quietly. "About the marshals?" "Sent the telegram myself, though whether they'll come, and how fast—" Brennan shrugged. "Best keep that watch tonight." As the night wore on, Margaret found herself stationed with the women preparing for the morning ceremony. But her mind kept turning to Redden's threats. Would Kane really attack with so many witnesses, or did he have something subtler planned? "Stop fretting," Rosa advised, appearing with coffee. "Whatever comes, we'll face it." "I just want one day," Margaret said. "One perfect day to open the school properly, to show what we've built." "Then that's what we'll have," Rosa said firmly. "Kane's taken enough. He doesn't get tomorrow, too." As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky purple and gold, Margaret stood before the school. Despite everything, the threats, the fire, the fear, they'd done it. The Cedar Springs School was ready to open. Jim appeared beside her, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt. How are you holding up?
Terrified, she admitted. Excited, proud, all at once. That's my girl, he said, pulling her close.
Ready to make history?
Ready? Margaret confirmed. Whatever Kane had planned, whatever challenges awaited, she would face them. The school would open. The community would endure. And maybe, just maybe, they'd all learn that some things were stronger than threats, things like hope, determination, and the courage of ordinary people standing together. The sun rose fully, bathing Cedar Springs in golden light. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing. It was going to be a beautiful day for a school opening or for a fight. Margaret squared her shoulders. Ready for either. The real test was about to begin. The morning of the school opening dawned clear and bright. Margaret stood before her mirror, pinning up her hair with steady hands despite the butterflies in her stomach. Through the window, she could see families already gathering at Cedar Springs, children in their Sunday best clutching new slates. Ready! Jim appeared in the doorway, looking handsome in his dark suit. As ready as one can be when expecting trouble, Margaret replied, smoothing her best blue dress. Maybe Kane was just bluffing. Maybe. The sound of approaching horses cut him off. Many horses riding hard. Jim's hand went to his gun, but Margaret caught his arm. Wait, look. Through the window, they saw Deputy Marshal Sam Wheeler riding at the head of a column of lawmen. The federal marshals had arrived, just as Judge Brennan promised. Relief washed over Jim's face. Well, I'll be damned. They actually came. At Cedar Springs, the atmosphere was electric. Children fidgeted excitedly while parents kept watchful eyes on the horizon. Margaret noticed armed men positioned strategically around the gathering, trying to look casual but fooling no one. Marshal Wheeler approached Jim and Judge Brennan. Heard you folks might have trouble. The territorial governor takes threats against schools seriously. Appreciate you coming, Marshal, Jim said, though I hope we won't need you. Best kind of job where nothing happens because we're here. Wheeler's weathered face cracked a smile. Nice school. Be a shame if someone tried to disturb the proceedings. Margaret busied herself with final preparations, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice she glimpsed riders on distant ridges, too far to identify but close enough to observe. Miss O'Brien. Billy Patterson appeared, clutching his written speech. I'm ready whenever you are. You'll do wonderfully, Billy. She squeezed his shoulder. Your words will mean more than mine because they come from someone who's lived here all his life. The ceremony began at 10 o'clock sharp. Margaret stood on the school's front steps, looking out at nearly 50 people, ranchers, cowboys, wives, and children. Even some townspeople from Tombstone had made the journey. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying clearly. Today we dedicate not just a building, but a promise that knowledge and opportunity belong to everyone, not just those in big cities. A promise that your children... That's far enough. Silas Kane emerged from behind the wagons, flanked by a dozen hard-faced men, but he stopped short when he saw the federal marshals, his confident swagger faltering. Mr. Kane, Judge Brennan said mildly, come to witness our school opening. I've come to serve legal papers. Kane pulled out a document, challenging the land claim. This gathering is on disputed property. Actually, Margaret said, stepping forward, I believe you'll find that challenge was withdrawn yesterday. Kane's face went rigid. What are you talking about? Margaret produced her own papers. Your employers in Chicago, the Barrett Land Company. They received some interesting telegrams about their representative threatening children. Apparently, bad publicity affects stock prices. She watched comprehension dawn on Kane's face. The letters she'd written, the church groups Martha had contacted, they'd reached the right people. You're lying, Kane snarled. Telegraph office in Tombstone has copies. Judge Brennan offered,
Your employers were quite explicit. All claims to Cedar Springs are withdrawn, and your services are no longer required.
For a moment, Kane stood frozen. Then his hand moved toward his coat.
I wouldn't, Marshal Wheeler said quietly. Several rifles shifted to cover Kane's men. You're done here, Kane. Take your boys and ride out.
This isn't over,
Kane hissed, glaring at Margaret.
You think you've won. You've just painted targets on all your backs.
The only target here is on yours if you don't leave. Now. Jim stepped protectively closer to Margaret. Kane's hired guns looked between their employer and the federal marshals, calculating odds, one by one. They backed toward their horses.
You haven't heard the last of this,
Kane promised, but the threat sounded hollow now. As they rode away, Cole Redden lingered a moment. His eyes found Jim, and something passed between them, unfinished business that would need settling someday. Then he too was gone.
Well,
Margaret said into the silence.
Shall we continue?
A cheer went up from the crowd. Billy Patterson, emboldened by the victory, read his poem with growing confidence. His words about learning and growing brought tears to many eyes, including his father's. Margaret officially opened the school doors, and children flooded inside to see their new classroom. Parents followed, marveling at the books, the maps on the walls, the neat rows of desks.
It's beautiful,
Mrs. Henderson breathed.
A real school, right here.
It's a start, Margaret said. With your support, it can grow. More teachers, more resources, maybe even higher grades eventually. Tommy Martinez raised his hand. Miss Margaret, does this mean you'll keep teaching even after you marry Big Jim? Laughter rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt her cheeks warm, but answered firmly. Yes, Tommy, teaching isn't something I do, it's who I am. That won't change.
Good,
Rosa declared. This community needs its teacher, and its teacher needs this community. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activities. Students tried out their desks, parents discussed curriculum, and plans were made for regular attendance despite the distances involved. Some families would board children with closer neighbors during the week. Others planned to take turns providing transportation. As the sun began to sink, Marshal Wheeler approached Jim and Margaret. We'll patrol the area for a few days. Make sure Kane really clears out, but I don't think he'll be back. Men like him are cowards at heart. They only fight when the odds favor them. Thank you, Marshal. Margaret said, for everything. Thank you, ma'am. Takes courage to stand up to men like Kane. The territory needs more people like you folks. As the last families departed, Margaret and Jim stood alone before the school. The building cast a long shadow in the setting sun, but its windows caught the light, glowing like beacons.
We did it,
Jim said, wonder in his voice.
We actually did it.
The community did it, Margaret corrected. We just helped to point the way. He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder. So what now, Kane's gone? The school's open? Now we build, Margaret said. We teach, we grow. We make this place everything we dreamed it could be. And us, Jim asked softly. What about our dreams? Margaret looked up at him, seeing in his eyes all their shared hopes for the future. Those two, especially those. A month later, the school was thriving. 28 regular students, ranging from 6 to 16, filled the classroom with eager voices and scratching slates. Margaret had established a routine that balanced academic basics with practical skills the children would need for ranch life. She stood at the blackboard, explaining fractions through the example of dividing water rights among different pastures, when she noticed a familiar figure through the window. Sarah Wilson, barely 20, stood uncertainly by the gate. Class, please continue with your exercises, Margaret instructed. Emma, would you help the younger children? Emma Patterson, fully recovered and serving as a student assistant, nodded importantly. Margaret stepped outside to greet their visitor. "Miss Wilson, can I help you?" The young woman twisted her hands nervously.
I heard about your school. What you've built here? I'm a teacher too, or was back in Missouri. But times got hard and... You're looking for a position, Margaret guessed gently.
"I know you probably don't need help, but I thought maybe I could volunteer. I miss teaching so much, and I have nowhere else to go." Margaret studied the young woman, seeing shadows of her own desperate journey west. "Can you handle ranch children? They're different from city students. I was raised on a farm. I understand hard work and practical needs." "Can you start Monday?" Sarah's face transformed with hope. "You mean..." "We've been needing an assistant teacher. The pay won't be much at first, but there's room and board at the Hendersons' place. They've been looking for someone to help with their younger children in exchange."
"Oh, Miss O'Brien, thank you. You don't know what this means." "I think I do," Margaret said softly. "Someone once gave me a chance when I needed it most. Now it's my turn to pass that kindness on."
That evening, at the Circle M, Margaret shared the news over dinner. The ranch hands cheered. Many had younger siblings who could now attend more regularly with 2 teachers available. "You're building something bigger than a school," Jim said later, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear. "You're building a future for this whole region."
"We're building it," Margaret corrected. "None of this would exist without you, without everyone who believed it was possible."
Jim was quiet for a moment, then said,
"Pa would have been proud. Of the school, the community coming together, all of it." "He'd have been proud of you," Margaret said.
"Of the man you've become, the leader this community needed."
"Speaking of the future," Jim said, turning to face her,
"Judge Brennan will be back next month for the circuit court. I was thinking maybe he could perform another ceremony while he's here." Margaret's heart skipped.
"Jim Morrison, are you asking me to set a wedding date?"
"I'm asking if you're ready to make it official, to be my wife. Not just in promise, but in fact."
"Yes,"
Margaret said without hesitation.
"Next month, with the whole community there to witness."
"At the school. Where else? It's where our future truly began." As if in blessing, a shooting star streaked across the sky. Margaret made a wish for continued peace, for the school's growth, for all the dreams they were building together. Inside the house, Rosa began playing her guitar, and voices joined in an old Spanish love song. The sound drifted on the night air, mixing with the distant howl of coyotes and the closer sounds of the ranch settling for sleep. "No more midnight fires?" Jim asked, referencing their storm-sheltered confession.
"Oh, I don't know," Margaret said with a smile.
"I think there's room in our future for a few more wild moments, but balanced with days like today, victories earned through patience and courage rather than violence." "A teacher's wisdom," Jim said, pulling her closer.
"A rancher's practicality," she countered.
They sat in comfortable silence, planning their wedding, their future, their continuing work for the community. The school stood ready for tomorrow's lessons. Sarah Wilson would bring fresh energy and ideas. The water rights were secure, the land protected by law and community vigilance. Not every battle had been won. Cole Redden was still out there somewhere, and men like Cain would always exist. But for now, peace reigned at Cedar Springs. Children would learn, families would prosper, and love would flourish under the vast Arizona sky. Margaret touched her mother's locket, thinking of the journey that had brought her here. From desperate flight to finding home, from solitary teacher to beloved member of a community, from guarded heart to loving freely. The desert had tested her and found her strong. The community had embraced her and found her worthy. And Jim had loved her and found her essential to his own happiness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but tonight, surrounded by love and achievement, Margaret O'Brien, soon-to-be Morrison, was exactly where she belonged. 5 years had passed since the morning Kane's men rode away from Cedar Springs. The December sun cast long shadows across the expanded schoolyard where Margaret Morrison stood watching her students rehearse for the Christmas pageant. The original building now boasted 2 additional rooms, and a second smaller structure housed the Locket Silver Library, named for her mother's necklace that had seen her through so much. Mrs. Morrison. Should angels stand on the right or left? Emma Patterson asked. At 16, she'd become Margaret's chief assistant, helping with the younger children while pursuing her own advanced studies. Wherever allows the shepherd's room to enter, Margaret replied, one hand resting on her rounded belly. Her 3rd child would arrive with a spring, another blessing in a life that had become richer than she'd ever imagined. "Mama, watch me," 4-year-old James Jr. called out, attempting to balance a makeshift crown on his head. His sister Catherine, 2 years older and serious like her mother, tried to help him adjust it properly. "Careful, little king," Margaret cautioned, moving forward just as Sarah Wilson caught the toppling boy. "Got him." Sarah laughed. In 5 years, she'd grown from desperate refugee to confident educator, even marrying Tom Henderson and starting her own family. The circle of kindness continued to expand. The sound of horses drew Margaret's attention. Jim rode in with several hands, their faces grim despite the festive preparations around them. She knew that looked trouble brewing, though of a different sort than the old days. "What is it?" she asked when he dismounted. "Drought's worse than we thought. The Petersons are talking about selling out, moving back east, if they go." He didn't need to finish. The domino effect of one ranch failing could topple others. "Then we find another way," Margaret said firmly. "We've faced worse." That evening, the ranch families gathered for what had become a monthly tradition: communal dinners where joys and challenges were shared equally. The conversation quickly turned to the water situation. "Creek's down to a trickle," Patterson reported. "Haven't seen it this bad since '81. "My cattle are getting thin," Weatherby added. "Feed prices are through the roof with everyone buying." Margaret listened, her mind working. "What about the agricultural reports from the territorial office? They've been documenting new water management techniques." "Book learning won't make it rain," someone muttered. "No," Margaret agreed. "But it might help us use what water we have more efficiently." "Sarah, didn't your brother write about those new irrigation methods they're using in California?" The discussion continued late into the night, with Margaret and Sarah pulling out maps and sketching possibilities. It reminded her of another night years ago, planning a school that seemed impossible. Now they were planning survival itself. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A young woman in traveling clothes stood at the schoolhouse door, clutching a worn carpet bag. Something about her desperate dignity was achingly familiar. "May I help you?" Margaret asked. I'm looking for Mrs. Morrison. The teacher, I heard she might... That is, I was told she sometimes helps people who are lost." Margaret's heart constricted with memory. "I'm Mrs. Morrison. Please, come inside. Sarah, would you start the morning lessons?" In the quiet of her office, the young woman's story spilled out. Rebecca Winters, educated but penniless, fleeing a bad situation in Denver. She'd spent her last coins on stage fare, drawn by stories of a place where women could build new lives. "I can work," Rebecca said desperately. "I can read, write, do figures. I know some medicine. I was training to be a nurse before everything fell apart." "A nurse?" Margaret leaned forward. "Real medical training?" 2 years at Denver General before I had to leave. I know it's not much. It's more than we have now." Margaret made a quick decision. "The community's been talking about needing medical help closer than Tombstone. Would you be willing to teach basic health and hygiene to our students while helping establish a clinic?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You'd trust me. You don't even know me." "Someone once trusted me when I was desperate and alone." Margaret said gently, "That trust saved my life and built all this. Now it's my turn, our turn to pass it on." Jim found her later, grading papers while Catherine practiced her letters at a smaller desk. Their daughter had insisted on helping Mama work since she could hold a pencil. "Heard you hired another stray," he said, but his tone was affectionate. "A trained nurse. Jim. Think what that could mean for the community." "I'm thinking about what it means for our budget. We're already stretched with the drought." "We'll manage. We always do." She looked up at him. "Besides, she reminds me of someone, a desperate young teacher who once collapsed in the desert." "That teacher turned out pretty well," Jim said, bending to kiss her forehead. "Changed all our lives. Because someone gave her a chance." The Christmas pageant proceeded despite the community's worries. Children in homemade costumes acted out the nativity while parents watched with pride. Billy Patterson, now 17 and planning to attend the new territorial college, read from scripture in a strong, confident voice. "Hard to believe that's the same boy who insisted he didn't need learning." Margaret murmured to his mother. "You saved him, Mrs. Patterson whispered back. "Saved all of them." "They saved themselves. I just opened the door." After the pageant, the families lingered, sharing food and companionship despite their troubles. Margaret noticed Jim in intense discussion with several ranchers and made her way over. "If we share water rights temporarily, rotate grazing areas." "You're talking about changing how we've done things for decades." Patterson protested. "Because what we've done for decades won't work in this drought," Jim countered. "Margaret's right about those California methods. If we work together instead of separately, like we did with the school." Weatherby mused. "Pool resources. Share the burden and the benefits." "Exactly." Jim's face lit with possibility. "We survived Cain by standing together. We can survive this too." Margaret felt a surge of pride. Her practical rancher had learned the power of community cooperation. Together, they were stronger than the sum of their parts. As winter gave way to spring, changes came rapidly. The ranchers formed a cooperative, sharing water resources and implementing new conservation techniques Rebecca had found in medical journals that also discussed public health and drought management. The clinic opened in a corner of the expanded school, serving both students and families. Margaret's third child, another daughter they named Elizabeth Hope, arrived just as the spring rains began lighter than usual, but enough to sustain hope. She stood at the window of their expanded home, watching Jim teach Junior to ride while Catherine helped Sarah with the younger students. "Regrets?" Rosa asked. "Bringing tea." "About what?" "This life? You could have been teaching in a fine Boston school, married to a banker or lawyer." Margaret laughed. "Living half a life. You mean no, Rosa. This is where I belong, where we all belong." A commotion outside drew their attention. A line of wagons was approaching not one or two, but a dozen. Margaret's heart sank. Were more families giving up, leaving? But as they drew closer, she saw they were loaded not with household goods, but with lumber and supplies. Judge Brennan rode at the head, accompanied by what looked like half of Tombstone. "What's all this?" Jim called out. "Heard you folks were expanding again." The judge replied, "Figured you could use help. That young nurse of yours has been writing letters about establishing a proper territorial education and health center. Got the governor interested." Margaret looked at Rebecca, who blushed. "I just wrote about what we're building here, how it could be a model for other communities." "Well, your words worked." Judge Brennan said, "Territorial funding for expansion, plus donations from churches and civic groups. Seems everyone wants to see the Cedar Springs miracle spread." The miracle, Margaret thought, was nothing more than people helping people, building something larger than themselves. But if calling it miraculous brought resources to help more children learn and more families thrive, she wouldn't argue. That evening, another community dinner convened larger than ever with the Tombstone visitors. Stories were shared of other communities starting schools based on the Cedar Springs model, of young teachers inspired by tales of Margaret's work. You've started something that can't be stopped, Martha Hartley told her. Education spreading across the territory like wildfire, but the good kind. Tommy Martinez, now a skilled hand and part-time teacher himself, raised a toast. To Miss Margaret Mrs. Morrison, who taught us that books and brandings could go hand in hand, who showed us we could be more than we dreamed. To community, Margaret countered, raising her own glass of water. To each person who picked up a hammer or a slate, who shared what they had so others could have more. That's the real miracle. Later, as the gathering wound down, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the firelight. Cole Redden, older and somehow smaller than memory made him, hat in hand. Tension rippled through the crowd, hands moving toward weapons, but Redden raised both hands peacefully. Not here for trouble, he said quietly. Been hearing about this place for years. About what you've built. I've got a boy now, 8 years old. His mama died last winter. I want him to have better than I did, better than I gave others. Margaret felt Jim tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. What are you asking, mister? Redden. Asking if there's room in your school for a boy whose father did wrong. If there's a chance for him to learn what I never did, that there's better ways than violence to make your mark in the world. The silence stretched taut. Then Billy Patterson spoke up. Seems to me every child deserves a chance to learn. Isn't that what you taught us, Mrs. Morrison? Margaret looked at the man who had once threatened everything they'd built. She thought of cycles of violence and ignorance, of how education could break those chains. Bring your son on Monday, she said finally. Every child is welcome at Cedar Springs. Redden's weathered face crumpled with relief. Thank you, ma'am. I'll work to earn it, help with repairs, protection, whatever's needed. Just be a good father, Jim said roughly. That's payment enough. As Redden left, the gathering slowly resumed its festive air. Margaret found herself surrounded by her extended family blood relations and chosen ones alike. Students who'd become teachers, refugees who'd become pillars of the community, former enemies seeking redemption. Still think you just opened a door? Jim asked, pulling her close. Perhaps a few doors, Margaret admitted. But look who walked through them. Look what they built once they did. The stars wheeled overhead, the same ones that had witnessed her desperate flight years ago. Now they looked down on prosperity born of cooperation, education flowering in the desert, and love that had grown stronger with each challenge faced. What's next? Jim asked. What grand plan is brewing in that teacher's mind of yours? A territorial conference on rural education. Rebecca's corresponding with nurses about mobile clinics. Sarah wants to start a teaching college. And the children, our children, and all the others, they'll go even further than we dream. From one desperate woman in the desert to all this. Jim marveled. From one man willing to help a stranger, Margaret corrected. Every great thing starts with a single act of kindness. Jim, you taught me that. As the evening ended and families prepared for home, Margaret stood before the expanded school complex. Lamplight glowed in the windows where Rebecca was organizing medical supplies and Sarah was preparing tomorrow's lessons. Children's artwork decorated the walls, and books lined shelves that had once stood empty. The drought would pass, as droughts always did. Other challenges would come, but the foundation they'd built of education, cooperation, and community would endure. Each person helped became a helper. Each child educated became a force for progress. The circle continued to widen. Ready for bed? Jim asked. Baby Elizabeth sleeping in his arms while Catherine and Junior played quietly nearby. In a moment, Margaret touched her mother's locket, thinking of all the promises kept and new ones being born. Just taking it all in. Your wild desert kingdom, Jim teased gently. Our home, Margaret corrected. Our future, our legacy. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to change lives through the simple act of teaching and caring. But tonight, surrounded by the fruits of 5 years' labor and love. Margaret Morrison allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. She'd come west seeking a new life and had helped build a new world. The desert had tested her, and she'd not only survived but thrived. More importantly, she'd helped others do the same. The coyotes sang their ancient songs in the darkness beyond the light, but they no longer sounded lonely. They sounded like home. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and community in the Old West. I hope Margaret and Jim's journey touched your heart as it did mine. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts about the story. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Night for more stories of romance and adventure under the desert stars. Don't forget to like this video and hit the hype button to help more people discover these tales of the American frontier. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward your dreams.